All right, so let's get going on today's class. So now that we have finished up with everything that you need to know for the research paper, now that we've had the class for any final questions you might have with the research paper, and now that you are off and running and putting the final touches on your research paper, we can now spend the next week and a half finishing up on some issues that are very important in psychology research, very important experimental research methods, but just were not essential for your research paper. And the first one we're going to take a look at is generalization. So we introduced the idea of generalization very briefly in a previous class, but today we're going to expand on it and we'll take a look at it in depth. So the where's that piece? It works better with this. All right, so the plan for today is we are going to do an in-class demo on thinking and problem solving, and this has to do with the idea of feeling of knowing. So maybe you don't know something, but do we actually have a mechanism in our minds that will allow us to know that we're close to a solution, even if we don't really know what the actual solution is? So it's almost like that tip of the tongue phenomenon when you can't think of a word, but you know the word. It's just not coming to you. We're going to see research done on feeling of knowing. And that will lead into our discussion of replications, where we take a look at the different types of replications. And then we'll use that to illustrate one of the biggest things you can do with replications, which is discover boundary conditions. And then we'll wrap it all up with a look at failures to replicate, some very important psychological papers that were found to not replicate and what that means. And then we'll take a look at replications outside of the psychology lab. What happens in the real world when people try to replicate previous results? All right, so we're going to do our in-class demonstration. This does require sound, so we're going to switch over to the computer version of this, and hopefully we can get some sound on this. So for this, we're going to need to get back into groups. So why don't we just kind of do it by proximity? So if we want, if you can, get into groups of 2 and 3, and I will hand out the in-class demo handout here, and we'll go over exactly what we need to do in order to do this. So you're going to want to move a little bit into your groups because you are going to be discussing this amongst yourselves. You won't even need to be able to see the screen because you have all the information that you need in the handout, but we will give it a shot in terms of doing this replication of a feeling of knowing study. So for the in-class demonstration, you're going to be asked to solve a riddle. So what I'd like to do, just to continue our theme of group cognition, is to split up into groups for this. So we're kind of already organized into groups. So everybody in each row, if you can just come together so that you're close enough to discuss, and we will have our final group activity of the semester. All right, so I will explain everything that needs to be done. I will explain everything that needs to be done in the riddle. You can read ahead if you like, but there are some things that you will need to be informed of in terms of the method of this in-class demonstration. So you've been given a riddle, and you're going to try to solve the following riddle. I'll go over it in just a moment. And during your solution of this, you're going to get 10 minutes to do your best to try to solve this, but you're going to hear a click every 30 seconds. So every 30 seconds, you'll hear this sound. And when you hear that click, what I'd like you to do is rate how close you are as a group to solving that problem. So if you look on the first page, that's where the riddle is. If you look on the second page, that's where your ratings will go. So what you can do right now is you can circle next to the time of 0 minutes and 0 seconds. You as a group can circle 0 because right now you don't even know what the riddle is. So you are at 0, which is no idea what the solution is. When you have solved the problem, your scale will be at 10. So when you solve the problem, that's when you circle 10. And then in between those two periods, if you want to join any one of the groups, and I'll give you a handout here. So in between those two periods, depending upon how close you feel to actually getting the solution, circle anywhere between 1 to 9, right? So if the click occurs and you as a group are still thinking to yourself, we really have made no progress, maybe circle a 1, circle a 2 if you think you made very minor progress, not a lot. If you think you're almost there, like just a little bit more, we've almost got it figured out, we've almost got the whole thing, done, circle 7, 8, or 9. Basically indicate using that scale how close you think you are to solving the problem. And then when you actually circle that 10, if you could also circle the time associated with it so that we know when you actually solve the problem. So if you solved it at 6 minutes and 30 seconds, circle the 10 at 6 minutes and 30 seconds, and then also, just for ease of data collection, circle that 6 minutes and 30 seconds as well. So do this as a group. Try to solve the riddle as best you can. And then when you hear that click every 30 seconds, just as a group, come to a decision of how close you think you are and circle that on your timesheet. To make things a little bit easier, you can rip the thing in two so that you have a copy of the Sage's Hat problem sitting there with you. And I'll go over the riddle right now so we can get started. Yep.
So, do our circle answers have to be the same to form a group?
Yes. Yep. So as a group, you'll be working on this together, and then as a group, kind of decide where you are in terms of how close you are to a solution. So for groups that are a little spread out, you might want to scrunch in a little bit so that you can discuss this, and you can kind of collaborate on the riddle, which is the Sage's Hat. So I'll read this out to you so that we all are aware of what the riddle entails. So the Sage's Hat: the 3 wisest sages in the land were brought before the king to see which of them were worthy to become the king's advisor. So you're one of those sages. After passing many tests of cunning and invention, they were pitted against each other in a final battle of the wits. Led blindfolded into a small room, the sages were seated around a small wooden table as the king described the test for them. The king said, "Upon each of your heads I have placed a hat. Now you are either wearing a blue hat or a white hat. All I will tell you is this: at least one of you is wearing a blue hat. There may be only 1 blue hat and 2 white hats. There may be 2 blue hats and 1 white hat, or there may be 3 blue hats, but you may be certain that there are not 3 white hats. I will shortly remove your blindfolds and the test will begin. The first who correctly announce the color of his hat shall be my advisor. Be warned, however, he who guesses wrongly shall be beheaded." So you may want to make sure that you got the right answer. "If not one of you answers within the hour, you will be sent home, and I will seek elsewhere for wisdom." So with that, the king uncovered the sage's eyes and sat in the corner and waited. One sage, that's you, looked around and saw that his competitors each were wearing blue hats. For what seemed like hours, no one spoke. Finally, he stood up and said, "The color of the hat I am wearing is," and you need to figure out, is it a blue hat or is it a white hat? And you also, for a correct solution, need to give a reason why. So again, this is a situation. These are your competitors. You go around a table, you sit down, you get blindfolded. Blindfold comes off, you see 2 blue hats, and now you need to figure out that the color of the hat that you are wearing is And we begin. All right, so for some reason the clicks aren't working. So click, 30 seconds. How close do you think you are to a solution? Click. 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 Click.
That was a great, yeah, that was great. Yeah. So he uncovered all of their successful one stage of the round. So that his competitor. But if you're on the whiteboard, can you just see what they're having on? No, because it's.
Click.
Maybe. Maybe it doesn't have that. Yeah. Yeah, but don't.
Click. Click. Click.
Yeah. I don't feel like it's that easy.
Click.
I think we are.
Click.
Okay, so it's this. Why is it so hard?
Click.
So, well, how do we know it's them? We're the person who's dead.
Click. Click.
Wait, what? Say that one.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I don't think you would see it right off the It's like the complimentary ones. Oh, you didn't see it. I was gonna say, I think.
Click.
I think this is for. For that one. It's been some gifts. But see, that's why I was wondering, like, is he the one that because
Click.
Look.
I think it's the
See, yes. See, I'm trying to be logical. Yeah. I'm trying to be logical.
Click.
And even if there were, we still would have known color. Yeah, but we know he looks in the mirror, but we don't know what he's like.
Click.
No. I don't think so. If they did, I would love
And click. That is it. All right. So at this point, the time is over. So if you have an idea, if you want to take a guess, write down your solution. And remember that the solution also has to come with an explanation. So you can't just guess one or the other and say, because it's got to be one of the two. For a correct solution, it has to come with an explanation as well. And then if you can also, just so that I have this organized according to group, if you can just choose a group name for yourself, and where it says group on your timesheets, if you can put the name of that group so that I can keep them organized when I take a look at these results, this data, and I will come around to collect your sheets at this time. Okay, so I will add this to the data that I've already collected, but we do have previous classes' answers to this included today so that we can analyze replications. But so I won't leave you in suspense. The answer to this is that this sage over here was wearing a blue hat. Yeah. So the hat is a blue hat. And the reason for that is basically the key piece there is for what seems like hours. When it says in the riddle, it goes, oh, for what seems like hours, nobody spoke. For what seems like hours, nobody spoke. And that can only happen in one instance, and that instance happens when this individual is wearing a blue hat. And the way to kind of reason this through, or one way to reason this through, is to think about what does this sage over here see? So if you're wearing a white hat, they see one blue hat over here, and they see one white hat, right? So if this sage sees one blue hat and one white hat, then there's a question, what hat are they wearing? If they're wearing a white hat, then they are in a situation where you'll have a white hat, they'll have a white hat, and this person will be the only blue hat, and they would immediately say, oh my gosh, I'm the only one with a blue hat because the king said, no three white hats. So if you were wearing a white hat, this sage would be able to almost immediately answer, you know, there's a blue, there's a white. If I'm wearing a white, he's going to be a blue, so that he has a blue hat. The fact that neither of these two sages are answering means that they have the longest go around, which is like if you're wearing a blue hat. So that is the most difficult one to solve. That's the only option that's left if nobody has spoken for a certain amount of time. So that is the one way of solving this. The color of the hat that you're wearing is a blue hat. So that was the riddle, but more important than did you get it right is were you correct in how you felt about whether you were doing it correctly. So for those of you that answered blue hat and got the correct explanation, does your feeling of knowing indicate that you were getting closer to the correct answer? For those of you that didn't get the right answer or weren't able to complete it, what does your feeling of knowing indicate that you were, nowhere near completing the answer? That's the true interesting portion of this. Whether or not, especially if you got to the correct answer, even if you weren't consciously sure that you were at the correct answer, or you were getting close to the correct answer, is there some sort of subconscious, unaware mechanism in your brain that is working, or in your mind that's working on this problem, that gives you this feeling like you're getting close to solving the problem, that gives you this feeling of knowing, which is what it's called, that you're actually getting to the solution? So this is work that was done years ago by Janet Metcalfe. Actually, she did it here at Indiana University. And she gave subjects difficult problems to solve. Right? So these are intentionally difficult, so the problem isn't immediately aware. Most psychology experiments have these difficult problems to solve. So she gave subjects difficult problems to solve and then asked them to indicate in certain intervals how close do they feel they are to solving the problem. So one of them was the BC problem. So I'll read it out here. It goes, a stranger approached a museum curator and offered him an ancient bronze coin. The coin had an authentic appearance and was marked with the date 544 BC. The curator had happily made acquisitions from suspicious sources before, but this time he promptly called the police and had the stranger arrested. Why? So does anybody know the answer to this particular riddle? What's wrong with the date?
At the year 544 BC, they didn't know it was 544 BC.
Exactly. So the reason that he knew it had to be a fake is that if you were living in 544 BC, that's either before Christ or before the Common Era, you didn't know when that was going. You didn't know you were living in 544 BC. They did not call 544 BC in 544 BC. And that sentence alone will let you know why time travel stories are so hard to follow, because we lack the language for it. But that was the answer to this question. So they had this BC problem, and then she also used anagrams. She used jumbled up words, and you had to unjumble the words, to come to an English word. So she would have like a whole bunch of words, whole bunch of letters, and then you would unjumble them and be like, it's refrigerator. I get it, it's refrigerator. So those are the two tasks. And then what she did is she ran her subjects individually, and she asked them to rate how close they were to a solution at 10-second intervals. So I always find this a little amazing because I kind of read the room sometimes when we do this demo, and students kind of feel like 30 seconds is too often. Can you imagine having to check in every 10 seconds to indicate how close you feel you are to a solution? Seems pretty quick, but that was what she did, how close they were in 10-second intervals. And once again, she had 0 being cold, she had 10 being solved, just like us. And let's take a look at what happened with the BC problem. So here are her graphs for the BC problem. Here are the results for the BC problem. And this is the data for people that were correct. People that basically said, if you were living in the time of BC and minting coins, you didn't know it was BC, so you wouldn't have minted it 544 BC. These were people that got it incorrect. So these were people that said, well, maybe that metal wasn't invented in 544 BC. Maybe the curator saw this person's picture at the post office on the most wanted sign. So the height of each of these bars indicates how many subjects indicated feelings of warmth over here. So this is 0 over here. This is 10 over here. So the higher the bar, the more people indicated, in this example, 0 feelings of warmth, absolutely cold. And then, and this is the really key part, this were their ratings when they solved the problem. So when they said, oh, I have the solution, that time was marked. And then she looked at what were their ratings 10 seconds before that time. And what were their ratings 20 seconds before. And what were their ratings 30 seconds before. So this rating here, a feeling of warmth, were how these subjects felt 30 seconds before they came, in this case, to the wrong solution. And then this was 40 seconds before. So what we can see here is that there seems to be a very distinct pattern that occurs in terms of feeling of knowing. So if you take a look at this incorrect solution, 40 seconds out and 30 seconds out, people are pretty sure, most people are sure, I'm not close to a solution. Right? So 40 and 30 seconds before, they were like, oh, right, it's he must have seen his picture at the post office. 40 and 30 seconds before they came up with the wrong answer, most of them were like, I have no idea what's going on. I'm rating it a 0. But notice what happened at 30 seconds. All of a sudden, more people started to feel like they were closer and closer to a solution. And then at 10 seconds, you can see that the highest bar shifts once again. So more and more people felt they were closer and closer to a solution until 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Oh, I get it. Yeah, they must have seen their photo at the post office. The metal was wrong. It was a wrong picture on the coin. That must have been the reason, and they ended up with the incorrect solution. So this gradual increase in feeling of knowing is a pattern that occurred when you got to the incorrect solution for this BC problem. Any questions on that? No? All right, so that's for the incorrect solution. Extremely interestingly, notice what happens for the correct solution. So subjects who ended up with the correct solution at 40 seconds out, 30 seconds out, 20 seconds out, or 10 seconds out from the solution, they all still felt they had no idea what the solution was. So even 10 seconds before they realized, oh, wait a second, it's BC. Even 10 seconds before, they were still thinking to themselves, I have no idea whatsoever. Nothing get, oh, wait a second. Oh my gosh, it's BC. And then they get the solution. So this was the pattern that was found in the correct solutions. And even though these individuals were getting closer and closer and closer and closer to having a solution, they had no feelings of knowing. They had no feelings of getting closer to the solution until it actually occurred to them. And most kind of shockingly, the ones that did think they were getting closer to a solution were actually getting closer to an incorrect solution. So it's almost as if you have a mechanism that's going to lie to you. That, oh yeah, you're getting closer. Yeah, don't worry, you're doing all right. It's wrong, but you're getting closer to the solution. So it was a really kind of bizarre pattern that when you're right, you have no feelings that you're getting closer to the answer. But when you're wrong, you kind of increase in your feelings of getting closer to the answer. All right, so any questions about the BC problem? All right, well, let's take a look at anagrams. Mixed up letters. So the BC problem, let's backtrack just for a sec. The BC problem, this is an interesting problem because this is what's often known as an insight problem. This is what oftentimes leads to aha moments because this whole problem can only be solved in one step. There's only one realization to make, there's only one thing to realize, and that's the date and what it means. And then once you made that realization, it's solved. So you kind of have this aha phenomenon where you don't know what the answer is, and then all of a sudden, aha, eureka, I got it, it's the BC. Anagrams, on the other hand, these are jumbled up words. And when you're doing jumbled up words, if anybody's ever, played those games before, you know that there are certain rules, right? You know that there are certain steps that you can take to increase your chances to get close to the solution. So for example, has anybody ever done these word scrambles, word jumbles? What do you typically do when you do one of these scrambled words? What might be your first step? But which letters?
I look at first letters.
So you look for some first letters.
And vowels.
And vowels. So what do you do with vowels? Do you put them all together?
You pay attention to the vowels, but I basically put each vowel in front of a consonant that I have.
Okay, so that's a step, right? You know in the English language, if you have E, A, O, U, that's probably not going to be together in the word, right? You're probably going to have some consonants between it. So step number one is you can take them and you can start putting some consonants between it, right? Step number two, if you see words that typically go together, you're going to place them together. So if you see a Q, you're going to be looking for that U, and you're going to put the Q and the U together. If you see an E and an R, you might think to yourself, oh, okay, this might be or it might be re, but they probably are going to go together. If you see an S, chances are it might go at the beginning, because there's a lot of words that begin with S. Chances are it might go at the end, because there's a lot of plural words that end in S. But you can kind of start putting things together. You can start moving it around in ways that English language works. So an anagram would seem to be this multi-step problem. You kind of start organizing the letters, you kind of start putting them together, and you should feel like you're getting closer to solution even before you can see, for example, the word refrigerator. Well, let's see what actually happened. In actuality, it's kind of the opposite. So once again, we have incorrect solutions over here. We got correct solutions over here. Once again, we have how do the subjects feel when they were 40 seconds away from solving it, 30 seconds, 20 seconds, 10 seconds away from solving it, and how do they feel when they actually solved it. And once again, we'll start off here with the incorrect solutions. And notice that 40 seconds out, 30 seconds out, 20 seconds out, 10 seconds out, they still thought they were nowhere near a solution. So even when they put their Q's and their U's together, even when they split up their vowels so they're not all together, and even when they put E's with R's and S's at the end, they still had no idea that they were at a solution until they finally came to a solution, and in this case, came to an incorrect solution. So the word is refrigerator, but they put, Jeffitator. It's like, oh yeah, it's a Jeffitator, of course, I know that. But you can see here that a lot of people still did not know, I guess when time expired, that they were still pretty confident, like, I think it's a word, but not really a word. But that's a pattern for the incorrect solution. And the same thing for the correct solution. People that came up with the right word felt that they were nowhere near 40 seconds out, nowhere near 30, nowhere near 20 seconds out, nowhere near 10 seconds out. And then all of a sudden, it just kind of came to them, and they were like, oh my gosh, there it is. Refrigerator, I get it. And they had that solution. So that is Janet Metcalfe's work back from 1986 on feelings of knowing. So any questions on her work? On her findings? All right. So we're mentioning this work because what we did today is basically a replication of Janet Metcalfe's work. So a replication is basically what it sounds like is when you do something, again, you replicate a particular experiment. It's what your method section is meant for, so that people can read your method section and replicate your experiment. So replications, there are different types of replications. There's your exact replication, and then there is a conceptual replication. Those are the two types from your textbook. Some people consider a third one, but we'll go with what your text has. Two types, exact replications and conceptual replications. Exact replications are pretty easy to understand. These are literally just redos of the experiment. You repeat the experiment as closely as practical, and you change as little as possible. So you are going to have to change some things, right? You can't use the same subjects that were around in 1986, right? Janet Metcalfe will not come out of retirement to run this experiment for you, right? So there are some things that we need to change, but you change as little as possible. Basically, you go to that publication and you go to the method section and you say, all right, experiment number 1, procedure. Subjects were given a sheet of paper. I'll give subjects a sheet of paper on which was written the BC problem. I'll give them the BC problem. They were told that they would be asked to write down a number between 0 and 10. I'll tell them to write down a number between 0 and 10, right? So you do it as closely as possible to the original experiment, and that is your replication. And then, incidentally, that's literally where I got the BC problem from. All right, so that's an exact replication. Not too difficult to understand. You just redo what you've done before. More interesting, though, and more, I would argue, valuable, is the conceptual replication. So the conceptual replication is where you repeat the experiment, but you change some aspects of the variables. You change some way of doing the experiment. So in an independent variable, you might change the operational definitions, right? So you might change how it is that you measure feelings of knowing, for example, right? How it is that they're using a scale of 0 to 10. You might use a scale of 0 to 7, right? You might change it by saying, instead of having them self-report, I'm going to hook them up to a galvanic skin response machine. I'm going to basically hook them up to a lie detector test. And I'm going to see if they have physiological responses that they're getting close to the answer. So you can change your independent variable, for example, their operational definitions. You can change the operational definitions of your dependent variable. So what is it that you're measuring? You're measuring feeling of knowing. Are there other things that go along with feeling of knowing? You can change how you measure those. So the galvanic skin response would actually be the independent variables changing their operational definitions. And then also, very importantly, you can change the control variables. So control variables are, in any experiment, there are some aspects of the experiment that could change, that could be different, but you keep them the same for every single subject, right? So in this experiment, Janet Metcalfe's experiment, the time between when subjects had to check, had to indicate their feeling of knowing, that could have been 10 seconds. She used 10 seconds. It's quite possible to do that every 30 seconds. We just did it every 30 seconds. It's quite possible to do it every 10 seconds, 20 seconds. It's quite possible to just do it every single minute. So there's a bunch of variable values that it could take, but what you do in an experiment is you just make a decision and you say, I want the same level for every single subject, so I'm going to do it 10. So Janet Metcalfe said, one of my control variables is going to be the time between responses. I'm going to choose 10 seconds. And when I did this replication, I said one of my control variables is going to be the time between responses, but I'm going to choose 30 seconds. Right? So there's a number of different control variables that go into any experiment. Which riddle do you choose? She could have chosen the BC problem. She could have chosen the sage's hat. She could have chosen the two monk problem. She could have chose, Achilles versus the turtle. She could have chosen a number of different riddles. Those are all that's a variable. Which riddle are you going to choose? But she said, I want one riddle for all my subjects. I'm going to choose the BC problem. I chose a different level. I said, I want one riddle for all my subjects. I chose the sage's hat. So in these conceptual replications, you can change those control variables, the levels that they have. You can change the dependent and independent variables, the operational definitions that you use. So far, so good? All right. So why would you ever do this? Why would you ever do a conceptual replication? What are one of the benefits of doing a conceptual replication? Well, one of the benefits is that it's a great way of discovering boundary conditions, what's known as boundary conditions. And what a boundary condition is, these are the specific conditions or criteria outside of which the phenomenon you just found in your experiment will not operate. So they are literally the boundaries at which the phenomenon that you found will fail to occur. And those boundary conditions are very important in psychology because you want to know, will this psychological effect work in general? Will it have no boundary conditions? It just works for everybody all the time? Or does it have certain boundary conditions? Is there a boundary condition in terms of how you phrase it? Who it applies to? What time of the day? What are these possible characteristics where the phenomenon that you found, outside of those characteristics, it would not occur? So let's take a look at some boundary conditions, and let's see if we can find, identify any boundary conditions for our results. So if you take a look at our results for people that achieved the correct solution, all right, so these are our results over here. These are Janet Metcalfe's results. So what Janet Metcalfe found was that if you solved the problem correctly, you would have no feeling of warmth, no feeling of warmth, no feeling of warmth, no feeling of warmth, and then boom, you would have that feeling of warmth. On the other hand, what we found in previous classes, and what we'll probably find with this class as well, so this is previous data, what we found is that for subjects, when they were 120 seconds out from the correct solution, when they were 120 seconds out from saying, oh my gosh, it's a blue hat, because if it was a white hat, that other sage would be able to solve it immediately, so it's got to be a blue hat. For subjects who said blue hat, 120 seconds out, they thought they were getting close, right? So about 2 minutes out, they were like, I'm about a third of the way, right? 3 was the highest rating. And then when it got to about 90 seconds out, it was in around this area. It was in around the 5 to 6 area. And then when it got to 60 seconds out, sorry, 60 seconds out is here. When it got to 30 seconds out, they felt even closer. Most of them said, yeah, I'm at about a 7 out of 10. And then when they solved it, they were like, yep, 10 out of 10, blue hat, there it is. So unlike Janet Metcalfe's results, where there was no increase in feeling of knowing before the solution, in our study for the SAGES hat, there was this increase in feeling of knowing before people got to the solution. So we did not replicate her findings. We did not replicate or get the same results. So what that means is that we have crossed a boundary condition. So this happened in her experiment. This phenomenon occurred in her experiment. That phenomenon did not occur in our experiment. We have gradual increases in feelings of knowing. So there's a condition that we crossed outside of which this phenomenon does not hold. So the question is, if that's the original phenomenon, these feelings of warmth follow an insight pattern, and we found that the feelings of warmth do not follow an insight pattern, we must have crossed a boundary condition. So what are the possible boundary conditions that we actually found? Other way to answer this, what was the difference between our study and the one that Janet Metcalfe did? So there are three major ones. Yep.
Did she have groups or?
So she did not have groups. So difference number one, possible boundary condition number one. She ran subjects individually, we ran subjects in groups. So clearly we've crossed a boundary condition. Maybe this pattern works with individuals, but this phenomenon does not hold when you're doing group cognition. So that was difference number one, groups versus individuals. There's two more. Yep.
The riddle that we use.
The riddle. So this was for anagrams and the BC riddle. We used the SAGES hat. Maybe the SAGES hat riddle is a different type of problem. Maybe it's a different type of riddle, and that's the difference that caused, that's the boundary that we crossed that caused this phenomenon to no longer occur. So that's two. There's one more. Yep.
The timing intervals.
The timing intervals. So she used 10-second intervals. We used 30-second intervals. So that could make a big difference. So imagine you have to check in with your group every 10 seconds. It's going to be, you'll basically have no time to dedicate to actually trying to solve the problem. So that could have been the boundary. Maybe this only works in a 10-second interval, but as soon as you get to longer intervals where you actually have time to kind of check in with yourself and say, how do I feel about this? You know, how am I before the clock strikes 10 again, and you're like, oh my gosh, I got to write down something. Maybe with this 30-second time interval, you actually have more time to access your inner feelings of knowing. So those are the possible boundary conditions we found. So the original phenomenon, it works for individuals, maybe doesn't work for groups. It works for 10-second intervals, maybe not for 30-second. And it works for BC problem and anagrams, maybe not for the SAGES hat. So I keep saying maybe for each of these. So what can we do? What next experiments would we want to do to test which of these boundary conditions caused this failure of the phenomenon? Because it could be any one of them, it could be all of them. What would we do next? Yep.
Only change one of like groups, intervals, or riddles.
Exactly. So this conceptual replication has identified these three as potential boundary conditions. And we know that it's at least one of them, right? We have to have crossed some boundary to get to this. But which one of them is it? Is it more than one of them? We would want to do exactly what you suggested. We would want to test, we would want to replicate this experiment, but only change one thing. So we would want to use groups, but in a 10-second interval with the BC problem. Or we would want to use individuals, but with a 30-second interval and a BC problem. Or we'd want to run 3 experiments. We'd want to use individuals and the 10-second problem, 10-second intervals, but then do the Sage's hat. So if we ran individuals and the 10-second conditions, and we used the Sage's hat, and we replicated her findings, then we know that this boundary is not because of the Sage's hat, right? It had to have been because of one of the other 2. So what you would want to do is you would want to only change one of these 3, keep the other 2 the same. We would run 3 more experiments, and then that would identify which of these is actually a boundary condition, which one of these did we cross. All right, so that was our look at replications and boundary conditions. Any questions on that before we turn to failures to replicate? Make sense? All right. So now let's take a look at failures to replicate. So this is something that has become actually much more important in the last, I'll say 3 years, I think it's been, maybe a little bit longer than that. But very recently, psychology went through a massive replication project. So this replication project was meant for exact replications of big psychology experiments. So they wanted to do exact replications of psychology experiments, and labs across the world were basically given different psychology experiments to do literally exact replications of. Go to the method section, do it exactly. What they found is that 2/3 of these studies did not replicate and or had weaker results. So a large portion of them just failed to find the effects that they found before. And then a large portion of them, if they did find the effects, found them to a much weaker degree than they found before. So this was failures to replicate, and this basically indicated a replication problem in psychology. So this is from a report that came out about this this attempt, and you can see on this basically the ones that are in bold, successful replications. Right. Okay. So the ones that are in bold. The ones that are in bold are successful replications. The ones that are not in bold are unsuccessful replications. And you can see that in terms of successful replications versus unsuccessful replications, successful replications for this analysis, 54%. Only 54% of the psychology studies were successfully replicated. And when you go to a higher p-value for the sample size, that goes down to 50%. So in this case, you can see that there is this difficulty issue in doing these replications. So we're going to talk about a few failures to replicate that were known about even before this replication issue, before this replication problem. And we'll just discuss those so that you're aware of those. But when something doesn't replicate, that is a big red flag that the phenomenon itself is not real. So the analogy for this is the person that makes a basketball shot. So I don't think we got to this slide in the previous lectures, but let's just say that you are in a basketball court and you're there with your friend. And your friend takes that basketball, and your friend throws the basketball up in the air as hard as they can. And it goes off the scoring board, and it goes off the backboard, and it hits the court, and it lands in the seats, and it bounces back onto the court, and it bounces into the basket. And your friend is like, I'm the best basketball player in the world, right? There are two possibilities that are evident. Number one, your friend is the best basketball player in the world, and can just hit any shot at any time and should be in the NBA. What's the second possibility? What was that? It was a lucky shot. So whenever there's a successful experiment, there's always that probability. It's either yes, the experiment is real, aka your friend is the best basketball player in the universe, or the result is lucky, aka your friend had a lucky shot. So if you're on that basketball court and your friend is like, I'm the best player in the universe, it's again either true that they are or it's luck. How could you test it? Have them do it again. You basically just give him the basketball again and say, do it again. And if he throws it up in the air and it goes off the scoreboard and it goes off the backboard and it goes off the court and it goes off the seats and it goes back onto the court and it goes back into the net, then you're like, oh my gosh, you replicated your result. It must be true. You must be the best basketball player in the world. If on the other hand, they throw it up in the air, it goes off the scoreboard, hits them in the face, they get knocked out, then you're like, well, it was lucky the first time. Same thing with psychology. We do these replications because the way that psychology is built, the way science is built, is that any result could either be true or lucky. And one of the best ways to discover between those two is to just do that experiment again. So these are going to be some failures to replicate, which again indicate that these results here may not be true. These results may only have been due to a lucky bounce in the experiment. All right, so the first one we're going to take a look at is Barge et al. Automaticity of Social Behavior, Direct Effects of Trait Construct and Stereotype Activation on Action. So this is that paper right there, 1996. This was a huge paper. It's very highly cited. You can read about the details. I think it's in your Canvas supplemental articles. But what the main finding of it was that if you prime people with an elderly stereotype, that actually makes them walk more slowly. So what they would do is they would present people, for example, with lists of words. And these lists of words would either just be your average regular words, or they would be associated, much like the words in our list, they would be associated with the elderly stereotype. So they would be words like frail. There would be words like gray. There would be words like early bird special, the left blinker is always on, nobody turns it off, right? So they're asleep at 5 p.m., right? So they would have those elderly stereotypes. They would prime these university students with this elderly stereotype. And then what they would say is, they would say, all right, thank you very much, the experiment's over. And as the students were leaving the lab, they would have somebody in the hallway time how long it took them to just walk down the hallway. So they thought the experiment was over, but they were timed how long it took them to walk down the hallway. And what they found was that if you were in the group that was primed with the elderly stereotype, you slowed yourself down. Your body was slower than people that were primed without the elderly stereotype. So this was a huge finding. So you can see the citation count on this. I mean, Roediger and McDermott was high. This is like through the roof. And this is actually a few years ago. It's probably cracked, at least 4,500 by now. But that's the citation count. Absolutely massively influential paper. And its importance, it started the idea of priming behavior, embodied cognition. It started the idea of, I don't know if you've ever read research on the power pose, about how just kind of like standing like this can make you feel more powerful and it'll make you more assertive. That's embodied cognition. The idea that our bodies are also part of our minds, right? So our mind does not stop at the brain. Our mind includes our body. And actually our mind also includes the environment. That idea that your mind is just your brain is a very limited way. But this was one of the big important papers that started that, so that you could actually prime behavior. You could subtly prime behavior. You could get embodied cognition. So priming of behavior, just recently, if you take a look at elections, right? People prime ideas in elections. So the Trump administration, when they were doing their talks, when they were doing their campaigns, they would use the word invasion a lot. They kept using the word invasion here, invasion there, invasion there. Even if they weren't talking about immigration, they would use the word invasion. They were priming people to think about an invasion, so that when they talked about immigrants, you were cognitively prepared to say, yes, I'm thinking about invasion, so it must be invasions. And that kind of leads into this idea of stereotypes as well. We're just prepared to kind of believe the stereotypes. And it was one of the first kind of findings that kind of boosted this modern wave of these automatic and unconscious priming processes. So it's hugely important, but as it turns out, it's probably wrong. This is probably not a real effect. We're not at all accusing anybody of forgery or unethical behavior, but just like your friend that threw that basketball and ended up scoring the hoop, this was probably luck. This was probably a false positive, because people have actually published failures to replicate. There's actually 3 published failures to replicate for this study. And one of the things that historically has been true, not so much anymore in the last, very recently, like 3 to 4 years, but historically, you could not publish failures to replicate. Because failures to replicate can mean one of 2 things. Either this finding here is false, or you've made a mistake, right? There's 2 sources of failure to replicate. So the fact that these are actually published means that probably 100 manuscripts of failures to replicate were submitted for each of these. So these 3 probably represent 300 failures to replicate. It's just very difficult to publish a failure to replicate. So you can see that this here, this priming effect, probably, most likely not true, not the case. At least priming you with the elderly stereotype will not activate elderly behaviors. All right, any questions on that one? All right, let's take a look at 2 more. We got Snyder, Tank, and Bershai, 1977. Social perception on interpersonal behavior on the self-fulfilling nature of social stereotypes. So this is this article right here back in 1977. And what they did was they set up a situation where you were going to interact with another subject, but you were going to interact over the phone. And what they wanted to know is they wanted to know, does your perception of other people affect your interpersonal behavior, right? So oftentimes for example, in our entertainment, friendly people are typically depicted as beautiful people, right? So you take a look at movies and everything, the hero is always usually a beautiful person, the friendly people are usually beautiful people, but the evil witch, I don't even have to say evil ugly witch, probably ugly witch is already in your mind, evil people, not so nice. So the idea here was to find out, is it the fact that good-looking people, attractive people, are just nicer people, right? Maybe just being good-looking in the world just makes you a nicer person. Being unattractive makes you not such a nice person. Or is it how we perceive and interact with other people, that expectation that leads to this feed-forward loop? So what they did is they brought in subjects and they had them communicate by phone. So you never saw your co-subject, right? And there were 2 real subjects, but you never actually saw them. So they would set you up in one booth, and they would set the other person up in another booth, and you would initiate a phone conversation. And before the conversation began, the experimenter would just kind of casually let slip either that the person you're talking to on the other side is just really attractive. Right? So they would say something like, oh, I saw the person you were working with, and man, they are good looking. But anyways, have fun with the experiment, right? So they would just kind of give that an aside, or they would indicate that they're unattractive, right? And then what they did was they just let the conversation flow. After that, they had independent raters rate the conversations for friendliness. So they just said, here's 2 people talking. How friendly is this conversation? Here's another 2 people talking. How friendly is this conversation? And what they found was that physical attractiveness stereotypes created that self-fulfilling prophecy. If you thought the person on the other end of the phone was more attractive, you were more likely to have a friendly conversation. And if you thought that the person on the other side of the phone was unattractive, you were more likely to have an unpleasant conversation. So friendliness was caused by that activation of those attractiveness stereotypes. So people were friendlier to those that they believed were more attractive, and then that itself feeds forward, right? So think about your interactions. If somebody comes up to you and says, "Hi, how are you doing?" You would probably respond with, "Pretty good, how are you doing?" Right? You would have a nice, friendly exchange. But if somebody came up to you and said, "Hey, what's your problem? You dumb something," you probably wouldn't be sitting there going, "Oh, I don't actually have a problem. How are you?" Right? You respond negatively. So what they found was that if you thought somebody was attractive, you would be friendly to them. That in turn would make them friendlier to you. That in turn would make you friendlier to them, and it would just feed forward. If you thought they were unattractive, you would be subtly unfriendly to them. That in turn would lead them back to being unfriendly to you. That in turn would lead them back to be unfriendly to them, and it's this feed-forward loop. Citation count, probably at around 2,000 right now. At the time, 1686. And again, the importance, this was a hugely influential study from the 70s, and it's fit nicely with the ideas of the power of stereotypes and your bias and judgments to actually create reality, right? So when you're taking a look at stereotypes based on race, when you're taking a look at stereotypes based on sex, a lot of times that actually, the stereotypes a lot of times have sort of factual bases in them. Not factual bases, they actually have evidence in them, right? You actually will see that, the stereotype of, let's say, women in the workplace. If one of the stereotypes for bosses, female bosses in the workplace, is that they're bossy, right? I should say female supervisors in the workplace, is that they're bossy. The question becomes, are women actually more bossy? And the answer here is that in actuality, yes, they are. They actually will be more bossy. Why? Because of that self-perpetuating stereotype. So imagine that you had an employee. Imagine that I was an employee, and I had that self-fulfilling stereotype about female bosses, and I just felt that they weren't capable, and I felt that they were overly bossy, and that was my stereotype for a female boss. What's going to happen when my male boss comes to me and says, "I'd like you to file these reports"? Are they going to have to ask twice? No. I'm going to say, "Okay, yes, sir, I'll take these reports and I'll file them." And I'll file those reports because I have the stereotype of the male boss, and I'll be like, "Oh, he's really direct and very reasonable." If a female boss comes and she goes, "I need you to file these reports," if I have that stereotype of female bosses not being very good at their jobs, if I have that stereotype of female bosses actually being bossy, I might take those reports and I'll say, "Yeah, I'll get to it." So she comes back later and she's like, "Are those reports filed?" And I'm like, "Not yet, but I'll get to it." She's like, "Well, I need them filed." And I'm like, "Okay, fine, I'll get to it." So she comes back a half hour later. She's like, "Are those reports filed?" And I'll be like, "I'll get to it." Well, notice, she actually is being bossy because the male boss asked me once. Once is not bossy. The female boss has asked me 3 times. 3 times is bossy. And still not done. She's going to have to ask me a 4th time. So the question is, are females more naturally bossy? Probably not. I don't have the data on that. But has his behavior made her more bossy? Yes, it has. He's literally brought out bossiness from his female boss because she had to ask him 4 times. That's literally the definition of bossiness. So this really fit with that kind of narrative of the effects of stereotypes and bias and its effects on behavior. And it kind of, like you can see, I mean, it led to massive amounts of work, but kind of unbelievably, they failed to replicate it. People could not redo this experiment and get the same effects. And once again, they've actually published failures to replicate this. People have tried to redo this, and it seems that this is actually not true. This was, again, a fluke result, doesn't actually occur. All right, and then The last one that I'll mention, this one you've probably heard of before. This is Rosenthal and Jacobson, 1968, Pygmalion in the Classroom. I highly recommend, even though it didn't replicate, read this experiment, because this one is reported so often in textbooks. It's been distorted so often in textbooks, and one of its key findings is never mentioned, and it's been buried. And I'll mention what that is, but just real quick to get to it. Pygmalion in the Classroom. This was a study where psychologists told teachers that half of their students were going to be blooming that year. We've done a psychological study, and we can tell you half of your students, man, they're going to excel this year. The other half of your students, going to be average. And what they found was that at the end of the year, the students that were identified as ones that were going to excel, they did amazing. The students that were identified as being average, they didn't do amazing. Unknown to the teacher, there was no difference between the students. So it was just the teacher's reaction to the exceptional students and the teacher's reaction to the average students that brought about the excellent learning goals of these students and the not so good learning goals of the other students. So that was the main finding, that teachers' expectations are self-fulfilling and they actually cause student achievement. Citation count on this one, you can see it's hugely influential. It's in educational textbooks everywhere. You've probably heard it from more than one source just here at IUSB. And it was the first study that demonstrated that these expectations can be personally self-fulfilling. That if you have biases against people, that's actually going to impact how those people perform. But, and it was used to explain inequalities of race, class, gender, in school achievement, in just general life achievement. But there are just tons of failures to replicate. And if they do replicate it, they find out that the effect is very, very, very small. Now, just real quick. So has anybody ever heard of this study before? I see a few people nodding. So usually this is what's reported, right? Usually this is the what you'll find in textbooks, that the teacher's expectations are self-fulfilling. But I find, more importantly, there's a buried result, and that has to do with the teacher's opinions of the students. So you could group these students into four categories. There were the students who should do well and actually did well. There were the students that should do well and did not do well, right? So the ones that were identified as exceptional, there were those that actually ended up doing well, and some of them didn't do well. For the ones that were considered below exceptional, there were actually ones that did well. They beat the system. And then there were ones that didn't do well. They asked the teachers to rate which of those students, the personalities of the students, which ones were rated the least positively, which ones were rated as having the most attitude, which ones were rated as being the most troublesome. Any guesses out of those four groups?
The last group, one supposed to do well and didn't do well.
That is not the correct answer. They were not rated very poorly. So the ones that were supposed to do poorly and actually did poorly, teachers didn't think that they were the worst group of the bunch. Which one?
The ones that were rated poorly but did good.
The ones that were rated poorly but did well. They were the ones that teachers thought had the worst attitudes. They were the ones that teachers thought were the most abrasive. They were the ones that teachers thought were the biggest problems. And it kind of crushes your soul a little bit, because you would hope that these teachers would be like, oh, well, wow, what did this person do? They weren't supposed to do well, but look at them now. They did amazing. I really like this person. It's not true. You don't like the person. And I find it hard to believe that that got buried in a study that's been cited over 5,000 times, especially now that issues of gender and issues of diversity are coming to the forefront. And one of the expectations that people have is that female bosses will not do well, right? Black bosses will not do well. People that were typically not in these positions of power, they're not there for a reason, is what a lot of people believe. So when you put them into that position of power, they expect them not to do well. And you would hope that a woman that was placed as a CEO, and everybody looked at her and said, oh my gosh, well, there goes the company. and she takes the company to its best earnings, in the last 10 years, you would hope that they would be like, you know what, I was wrong about her, and I really like her, and I think this is being great. This study says that instead of that, they say, she shouldn't have done well, but she really did well. She's really bossy. I don't like her at all, right? Because it's just the reactions that they have. But anyways, this part, failed to replicate. All right, we went a little over time. Any final questions about anything that we've covered today? All right, so make sure that you're working on your research papers. Remember that Sunday at midnight deadline. If you came in late and didn't sign in, feel free to sign in. But other than that, we are done for today.